Welcome, Dr. David Engler from the Museo Nacional de Ciencias Naturales. He's a researcher at the place I just said in Madrid, Spain, an adjunct professor at the University of Nebraska in the United States, and honorary fellow at the Deakin University in Australia. His work bridges ecology, philosophy, and governance, focusing on resilience, complexity, and transformation. Co-author with Julie E. Maybee of Dialectical Ecosystems, Advances in Ecological Research from 2025. He explores Hegelian, Gödelian, and process-relation frameworks for understanding the dynamics of nature and mind in the Anthropocene. And then hello, Dr. Julie Maybee from the CUNY Lehman College in New York. She's a professor of philosophy at CUNY. She also founded Lehman's interdisciplinary disability studies minor. She's the author of Making and Unmaking Disability, the three-body approach in picturing Hegel, an illustrated guide to Hegel's Encyclopaedia logic, as well as articles on disability studies, African philosophy, educational theory, race, and 19th century Continental philosophy. Her work is united by an overriding interest in the way socially defined differences and time and place shape people's identities, knowledge, and experiences. And their talk will be about, or titled, Dialectical Ecosystems, Reconciling Opposites in the Science and Philosophy of Life. So go ahead.
Thank you very much. I start to share my screen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this really interesting conference so far. It's been pretty some mind-blowing stuff being discussed and presented, and I hope our talk can further illuminate a little bit the discussion centered about how we see the Hegelian framework playing out in ecosystem dynamics. And by this, we mean forests, lakes, rivers, coral reefs, whatsoever. So our talk will be based, as already has been announced, on our recent publication in Advances in Ecological Research, with a pretty similar title to the talk, Dialectical Ecosystems, Theory and Applications. And I hope by the end of this talk, it will be clear how a dialectical vision of ecosystems might benefit ecology. And for this, Julie will present the Hegelian scaffolding of our framework, a little bit narrow down how we use Hegel's connotations of dialectics. There seem to be different forms which doesn't seem to be clarified yet as to what is kind of the appropriate or not appropriate, I put very bluntly here. But then anyways, after Julie presenting of the scaffolding, we will move on to tie Hegelian dialectics to ecosystem dynamics and how they might pan out to bigger systemic changes like regime shifts in ecosystems. Imagine, for example, a forest turning into a desert or a clear water lake becoming turbid because of nutrient enrichment, stabilizing in a turbid state, never coming back to be a clear water lake. This might be an example. And from this discussion, we move on to present the dialectical integration and what it means to create hybrid regimes, especially under a dialectical view. Because from there's some interesting implications following up from theory for ecosystem management and how we usually govern our environment, and put this broader discussion into a perspective of why current theory falls a little bit short. What are the limitations? What are the obstacles? And what dialectical ecosystems can really contribute to bridge the gaps. And we will also show a little bit of application, tangible, more intangible, so perhaps a philosophical discussion is our final point of the presentation. So with this, I give the word to Professor Maybee. And whenever you're ready, Julie, I can switch the slide from here.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of what Hegel says about his own account of dialectics. His most in-depth presentation of his dialectical thinking is in the Encyclopaedia Logic. And there he describes it as involving three moments. The first moment is a moment of fixity, where there is a stable determination or definition of whatever topic he's talking about. Of course, in the logic, he's talking about concepts. Um, and then that moment of fixity has some limitation in it itself that leads to its own downfall in the dialectical moment, the second moment, in which the limitations of the first moment are evident, and the first moment's stable definition or determination evolves into its other. And I use other rather than opposite here. It's closer to the actual German word that Hegel uses, which doesn't have quite the same implications as our English word opposite. It just means set over against. And Hegel suggests that the first moment self-sublates into the second. So it's a problem or a limitation in the first moment itself that leads to the second moment. And then, of course, sublation, which is the weird English term that was kind of invented to cover a German term for which we really have no English equivalent, Aufheben, which means both to cancel and preserve. So in the second moment sublates the first moment in the sense that it both cancels because it's a new definition or determination, but also preserves elements of the first moment. And then finally, these two moments are resolved in a third moment, which he calls the speculative or positively rational moment, that is the positive result somehow of the opposition or otherness between the first two sides. Next slide, please, David.
Yes.
So, although there is debate over how we should read Hegel's dialectics into his own work, David and I don't really need to settle those debates. To give some examples that help to illustrate the ecological examples that we're interested in. So here are a couple of diagrams just describing there are certain moments in Hegel's logic in which either a running on process or an unending back and forth process. So the top illustrates the running on process, the bottom bubble illustrates the back and forth process, leads to the development of sort of a leap to a higher level concept. So one example Hegel gives is in the doctrine of quality, where a quality, a something, it turns out cannot be defined except in relation to its other. And so that's the limitation of it seems like you have a fixed something, but then you realize that it can't be defined except in relation to its other. So then that brings into view the other, which as an other also has to be defined as something, but it can't be defined as a something except in relation to its other, which as an other must come to be defined as a something in its own right, but it can't be defined except in relation to its other, and so on endlessly. And Hegel argues that this process of endless something others, something defined in relation to its other, something defined as a something in relation to its other, and so on, gives rise to a new level of thought, a new higher level concept, which he calls being for itself, that captures all of the somethings and their process of being related to one another. One can also think of this as a back and forth process where one something can't be defined except in relation to its other, which is a something that can't be defined in relation to its other, namely, in this case, the first something once again, and back and forth endlessly. And then being for itself is the concept of the quality itself that these somethings have in common, where being for itself does the work both of sorting out how they're the same as one another and how they're different. So, for example, if we think of red as a basic quality and the something others as instances of redness, then instances of redness and their relation to one another are captured by the concept of red itself as a quality. And it's a higher level concept because it captures all of these instances. He gives a couple of other examples that we mention in our paper. One is, and keep in mind that for Hegel, the dialectical process is supposed to apply to both thought or the life of spirit as well as being, there-ness, the physical world. So another example he gives is the process of measure, measureless, measure, which becomes essence. Here, an example he uses is ice. So ice is a combination of quality and quantity. It's a quality of water, we know, but a quality that only appears in relation to a quantity, namely temperature. But then as the temperature changes, the quality changes. The quality is no more, so the temperature rises, the ice melts, and we get the measureless something else. But that, like the other, has to be defined too. So then we have to define it as another measure, say steam. And then the endless process of these measures, ice, steam, snow, and so liquid, so on, gives rise to a new higher level concept, the essence, which we would say could be water. So water is a higher level concept that captures all these different ways of being there. Similarly, my final example, which we use in the paper, motion. Hegel argues that motion is another example of dialectics. In the heavenly bodies, to use his term, a planet is in one position, but then it has in itself to be in another position, and which has in itself the power to be in another position, and so on and so forth. And then this gives rise to the higher level concept of motion itself. And it's this dialectical process of resolution by a higher level concept that we particularly use in the paper. That's it for me, David.
Yeah, all right, I take over. Thank you very much, Julie, for presenting nicely this interrelation of something where something cannot be independently understood based on the relation it has with all other constituents present in an ecosystem. So what essentially the philosophical underpinning of Julie demonstrates is that sometimes in ecology we still work often in a too reductionist way, where we try to explain the dynamic of ecosystems, the broader, sometimes even incomprehensible, unpredictable dynamics based on some very narrow little constituents. Let's say I use an algae for predicting how the ecosystems behave. This is absolutely not possible because the tiny world of the algae is not representative of what is really happening at the ecosystem scale. They don't cover this process relational system dynamics. The algae alone does not account for all the emergent properties that are taking place. They can't explain adaptive behavior of the system. So we really need to discern between what's happening at the system level from those levels that operate at the constituent levels, like the algae, for example, or like phosphorus dynamics in a lake. Resilience and ecology, those emergent phenomena, operate really at the ecosystem level. And it's ultimately there when we have this focus on the systemic properties where we can understand system resilience, but also more increasingly important is the idea of regime shifts, right? Where at the whole system level, fundamental alterations can occur. Like as I mentioned already before, a shallow lake changing from a clear water lake to a turbid lake, because those lake regimes are kind of stable in themselves. Once a lake has shifted regime, it is very hard to move the system back from a turbid lake to a clear water lake. And I mean, it's with global warming, we enter a terrain where we can even expect a shift, as some researchers postulate, to a hothouse Earth regime, right? Where we have a fundamental change in our climatic conditions, where the Holocene climate, which has dominated the Earth system for thousands of years, has become obsolete. And we really tip over into a completely new climate domain, which can be this hothouse Earth. So you can really not address this major shift by focusing only on what one human is doing or what one animal is doing in an ecosystem. You really need to think systemic in systemic terms, and this is where a dialectical approach is coming in handy. And in the next slides, we will explore how specifically the dialectical thinking ties back to this narrative. So perhaps starting with a focus on system dynamics, in our paper, we distinguish between first and second order level processes. So as a first order example, and the somethings which depend on each other are wet and dry phases in transitory ecosystems like coastal environments or ephemeral lagoons or temporary rivers, which can undergo a change between wet and dry phases. So we have clearly a situation where we have, for example, after heavy rains, a lagoon filling with water, but this is not eternally sustainable. In ephemeral wetlands, perhaps due to climatic conditions, in summer it's warm, in Mediterranean ponds the water evaporates, and by its very definition, the wet period becomes unsustainable, and in Hegelian terms becomes sublated by its opposite, the dry phase, right? And we have this back and forth cycling taking place in the evolution of a transitory ecosystem, which characterizes simply its disturbance dynamics and the successional cycles. Yeah, right. Yet what we do not need to confound is a wet and a dry phase in those systemic terms, which I have explained below, with the Earth climate tipping into a hothouse Earth, perhaps, or a shallow lake tipping from a clear water regime to a turbid water regime. Because in the first order, as we conceive it here, this wet-dry cycling is part of the broader disturbance dynamics, the dynamics which dictates the whole ecosystem. So what this means, we have in this first order, due to this recurrent wet drying, an evolutionary process building up where we can reach emergent phenomena like the creation of seed banks, which tolerate desiccation. You have bed hatching strategies in organisms, which means once the wetland fills with water again, not the whole population is like emerging from the whole amount of resting eggs available in the sediment. It's only a small portion. And this is just a strategy to avoid in a catastrophically short wet period, when everything dries out and the organism didn't have time to reproduce, that the whole ecosystem collapses, right? So by just this bed hedging strategy is a kind of a higher order phenomenon emerging, which can no longer be reduced to how the organisms themselves behave either in the wet or in the dry period. We really need to integrate the broader picture of wet-dry to understand what's happening later on an overarching emergent level. And this example perhaps is also then suitable to engage the first order dynamics with the second order dynamics. And this is where we have already mentioned the systemic shifts taking place in the form of regime shifts, like Clear Lake's tipping into turbid. And we have here a picture on the right where we have a coral reef in a coral reef state, in a coral-dominated state in the left panel, and the algae-dominated coral reef on the left panel. So we have also imposed a traditional ball and cup heuristic, which we use in ecology for demonstrating regime shifts. So we have a basin of attraction, which is more or less reminiscent of the coral reef state, and a ball in it. And with climate warming and ocean acidification, this ball is constantly pushed over close to a threshold where the whole coral system is no longer tenable and sort of tips over into this algae-dominated state. And you can see once the ball rolls over into this deeper cup, which metaphorically presents high stabilizing configurations, it is really hard to push the ball back into the coral reef attractor. So this is where you have also a form of sublation process taking place at the second order, and dialectical synthesis, so to speak, where in the form of emergent dynamics, you have a new coral reef state emerging, which is now dominated by algae instead of corals. And this form of emergence is what we call in ecosystem science ecological resilience, right? It considers nonlinear dynamics and is not to be confounded with another connotation of resilience, which is often used in the health sciences, also in ecosystems, which is just recovery from disturbance, right? You might have a disturbance in ecosystems, that granted, but from this disturbance, a system recovers and stays more or less in its basin of attraction, which means more or less you can have a coral reef being perturbed, but after this perturbation, the system recovers and stays a coral reef. It does not tip over, right? So we have on one hand ecological resilience as a systemic change, and we have resilience in the traditional sense as simply a recovery process. And we frame this whole dynamics more or less in this conceptual diagram in a way where we have at the first level process opposites that preserve and cancel each other. This is where the dialectical tension comes in between those opposites. And I have talked about wet-dry phases, right? But there are many other examples in ecology like productivity or decomposition, the relationship between disturbance and stability, system homogeneity and heterogeneity. So this is more or less this bouncing back between the somethings, right? I do not want to use the thesis and antithesis bouncing back and forth, because you have in the wet state can be equally a thesis and antithesis, as well as the dry phase in the system can be thesis and antithesis. So we prefer to call it just opposites that preserve and cancel each other. And from there, yes, there can be produced a dialectical synthesis, which gives rise to emergent phenomena, like, for example, the coral reef in the coral state, or the coral reef degraded by anthropogenic activity into a algae regime, right? We can call them, for simplicity here, regime 1 and regime 2. And those systems can equally preserve or cancel each other. So we have, again, a tension of opposites between those different system regimes, which is inherent in the ecological resilience connotation, which I have explained before. So this dialectical tension sublation from one system to the next is more or less, as I already explained. You lose adaptive capacity of a system, its resilience erodes, as we say, and you surpass the tipping point in order for a novel regime to emerge, right? But here comes the important point into the game. You do not completely eradicate regime one. There's always some form of memory left, right? So you do not create a priori a completely new system, even if you talk about novelty. Within this novelty, you still have memory preserved from the old system, even though the system doesn't look like that any longer. And this memory can be preserved in the form of seed banks, plant and animal resting stages. It can be preserved also by connectivity, for example, by a healthy lake still being connected from to a already degraded one, where birds transport seeds from the healthy lake to the degraded lake. So this is what we call cross-scale interactions in ecology. And this more or less summarizes what we have already explained, this tension of opposites entering really into the picture here, the generation that results from this tension of opposites. And we talked about stability change, about adaptation versus transformation from regimes. And then here, perhaps the new points we want to add, this is just not only ecosystems, we have human beings there that are incorporated in the system. We already heard in previous talk that we never should sort of see the human external to the environment. It's kind of entangled. In quantum physical terms, human cannot be understood without the environment, and the environment cannot be understood without humans. So we have this perhaps material, experiential, if you will, relation where everything sort of forms a big unified whole instead of science being an external observer trying to identify objective truth, which kind of gets really blurry once you work at the ecosystem level, because you can justifyingly ask what is really the system here when you are entangled. So it becomes quantum physical there. But also, I mean, perhaps before getting too much into the weeds, I'm highlighting here also that you have a tension between deontology and consequentialism, which kind of enters the door for environmental management, because sometimes you can have strict deontology implications of you must preserve the environment, you must not intervene in how an ecosystem unfolds. But this can become counterproductive, right? If all of a sudden you have in a forest massive invasions of invasive species, which is not of your interest. And so it is really the deontology, consequentialism, also the tension between those opposites driving the whole ecological evolution here. So one interesting part of our framework, Julie and I think, is the connotation of a hybrid regime, where you sometimes enter in the sublation process a period, a transitional period where you can no longer clearly discern whether it is still regime one or is it regime two. So this is kind of reminiscent of Quantum's Schrödinger's cat, which is dead and alive at the same time. You can have wet, dry ecosystem states where you can no longer say, is this really wet or is this already completely dry? You have also coexistence at the systemic level where clear and turbid states sort of drive the whole dynamic. So you have ontologically something completely novel in this dialectical synthesis, from which something completely new generative can arise. And it's not only transitional in the strict sense as ecology has seen it so far. And coming back to our heuristic, this is where then the dialectical synthesis provides the ontological new higher order regime, a dialectical, a hybrid regime term from which dialectical ecosystem management derives. What this means in practical terms, dialectical ecosystem management recognizes you must not iron out tensions because they are generative of ecosystem dynamics. So you must account for these tensions and always try to find a middle way of managing your environment in a way to be conducive to providing us with the best possible ecosystem services. So it's entering the terrain of looking at cost benefits of management and how you can really identify trade-offs in management rather than trying blindly to optimize a system state when you cannot parse out past influences as many of the models currently do, right? And this is a little bit also here synthesized in the traditional ball and cup heuristic, which insinuates the ball shifts into something completely new. You need to manage the system based on this novelty which arises there, leaving behind the history and head. No, and dialectical connotation recognizes that what you create is a synthesized hybrid attractor. It integrates both the past regime and the new regime. This is where, so to speak, evolution runs back and forth in time at the same moment, right? As we have here already in discussions today, you have a synthesized hybrid attractors where old informs new and new is formed by old, right? This is something which we need to account for. So when one asks what a dialectical hybrid regime really is, then it is not some form of midpoint noise, but it is in itself a self-organizing structure, a form arising from a Hegelian synthesis, and it combines past legacies with novel feedbacks that arise as something completely new in a system. And this is not something isolated we observe in lakes. It's common to the whole new environment once you start to look at it under the lens of dialectical ecosystems, and you can find it in savannas, in forests, in coral reefs that we have already discussed, but also in other systems of humans and nature. So hybrid regimes do have a couple of key propositions. Where the first comprises, as I already said, ontological novelty. Those hybrid regimes are stable, but they are distinct in a way that they can no longer be reduced to what has been existing before, like a turbid regime ensuing from a clear water regime in a lake. But they're also distinct in a way that you cannot say that the turbid regime is something completely new. No, it is not, because the ontological novelty resides here in that the hybrid itself is the degraded regime and no longer the degraded regime per se, as resilient science has seen it so far. And those hybrid regimes in a more spatial context can be seen as mosaics that modify persistently based on environmental heterogeneity. And the emergent feedbacks are also feedbacks that recombine old and new into something overarching and novel. So you cannot really decompose hybrid regimes to anything what has been before without understanding what has been ensuing on what might ensue. So resilience somehow becomes irreducible, not explainable neither by the predecessors. And I would also need to add to this fourth point also what will arise in the future potentially. Because from there is always the Hegelian synthesis operating, which gives rise to these novel regimes. So at this stage, we have here in the introduction that I have some interests also in Gödelian dynamics. Kurt Gödel was an Austrian logician and mathematician who shattered the world of mathematics by showing that at least numerical system cannot be complete and consistent at the same time. This was a postulate back then in the world of mathematics. and like David Hilbert's ideas of mathematics, numerical system becoming eventually all theorems in such a system becoming provable. Gödel's conclusion was it cannot. So we have a lot of uncertainty going on there. Ontic uncertainty in a sense that a system becomes inherently undecidable. And this also touches on much of what we hear today. What are truths which systems can build on to grow or not to grow? I mean, we hear about Platonic realism, of Platonic transcendentalism, where we have worlds that are intangible to us, which sort of come down in the quagmire on how this dualism might contribute to ecosystem dynamics when something intangible is out there influencing dynamic without being ever provable, so to speak. So perhaps in our framework, we want to invoke more of an Aristotelian essentialism, meaning that, and we hear this in Dr. Wirtz's talk about, what was it, the Goethe's double law, right? Which seemed to me like, I might be wrong, please prove me wrong if I'm reproducing a little bit the metaphor here in a wrong way. But my feeling is the truth in an Aristotelian immanent sense is we work akin to a quantum potential. In quantum physics, we operate in a world full of potentials. And in this world of potentials, we need to consider an ecosystem like a bubble or a membrane, which cannot incorporate all the truths which float around in this broader world of potential. Only sometimes in the process of sublation, when the system in itself reaches its limitations, it opens its membranes, its pores, its channels, so to speak, and the bubble of the system lets permeate from this Aristotelian world of potentials new knowledge into the system. And as such, once these potentials enter a new system, these potentials can recombine in a complex process of co-construction. This touches inevitably on process ontology, perhaps, where whole new truth can emerge. And as such, once a system lets in this potential knowledge and actualizes it, then you can also kind of really understand how a regime shift takes place, right? So what we do, in fact, we let knowledge in from something which is around us, but not conceivable. And in this process, we can really then find the limits of our current system completeness, and as such, expand it. And this expansion is what takes place in the form of a regime shift, as we try to conceptualize our framework work with. So in this sense, a threshold acts as a triggers transformation. Threshold means here, as I said, the membrane opening channels, letting information in, but it is the whole constraint shaped, let's say the shape of the membrane itself is how it interacts with the whole potential field, which floats around in a vast, potentially infinite space, so to speak. I hope I have not been too abstract here. I just wanted to make this interlude to kind of build in what has been discussed so far, but also to make a precedent perhaps for the later discussion we might have in the when everybody chimes in. Yeah, what dialectical ecosystems management now offers is an extension of two approaches which have so far been dominated in the ecological science. The first RBM, resilience-based management, and the second is ecosystem-based management. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here. What dialectical ecosystem management does, it takes the good parts of each of these and really focuses on how tension can be harnessed in navigating uncertainty. So it's not about absolute knowledge. Ecosystems are never fully knowledgeable. So what we can is only try to navigate what we don't know, and as such subsume the certainty which more or less RBM and EBM strive for, and be a little bit more humble and be aware that given ontic uncertainties, we can only navigate and never solve environmental problems, at least at this scale. So this is not just a semantic nuance, it has important implications. Because nowadays in ecology, if you don't start your proposal or paper with "my approach solves the world," you won't get published, right? But we need to be more humble and really understand that at this level, we can only navigate given uncertainty. We will never be able to fill the epistemic voids needed for fully understanding system, which brings us back to Gödel. And as such, dialectical ecosystem management takes a more humble approach to how this can be done. So I'm close to wrapping up the talk. I mean, we have already had our example of a clear water lake here represented in blue, tipping into a turbid regime. Nevertheless, the turbid regime still keeping memory. So this is where the gray color of turbid intersects with the blue color of the desirable clear water regime state. And from there, we can derive the whole novel management approach, which is depicted in green, based on the dialectical synthesis between turbid and clear water regime. And this is then you can enter a loop where through ecosystem management approaches, mapping your ecological memory, using adaptive management and scenario planning, use artificial intelligence in inform policy designs. You can enter in a reiterative cycle to find blind spots in your system. Take the blur out of these blind spots. You never reduce the blind spots themselves, but at least you can take the blur out and then manage your system in this dialectical fashion. We have some applications here too, and one is a very nice example from the Vienna gasometers, where industrial shells, as you can see here in these 4 silos, which are exclusively served in the past to store gas for heating homes and stuff, became sort of an infrastructure for human and ecological development. So what you nowadays can find within those remains of the gasometers, it is an industrial complex of walls which enables people in the form of shopping centers, of living spaces, of office spaces. So you have really something new emergent based on something old. And the gasometers, they make kind of a nice example of how a hybrid emergent regime could look like in a social urban setting. But then also, I mean, for us ecologists, it's important to model if dialectical ecosystems shall be of worth, it should go beyond mere abstract theoretical conceptualization to also make it tangible mathematically, suitable for modeling. And this is where in a paper with another complexity scientist and a mathematician, we have tried to formalize mathematical approaches and bringing in a dialectical component. And you can see here in this representative formalism highlighted in blue, a dialectical term added to ordinary differential equation models. So this is also something I do not want to go too much into the weeds. It's sometimes the math has also been very challenging for me. I'm not so much of a quantitative ecologist rather than a theoretical conceptual guy, also trying to move more and more into the philosophical realm to understand the world better. But it's been an interesting interaction. And what I want to show here is that we are definitely able to move this beyond mere concept and ideas to also make it empirically tractable. And yes, more or less, I'm also coming already to an end. And I mean, we talked much about ecology, anticipated already implications for governance and management. This is just more or less a possibility of how can also be derived new ethical motives by looking at the tension between the ontology and consequentialism. And this is also a paper in which Julie has been involved, and people from governance, management, biogeochemists. We have also philosophers of science here, where we try to postulate a strange loop ethic model for making environmental governance more adaptive. And here it is simply you add a third layer between the ontology and consequentialism, which, based on the more than the sum of combining the ontology and consequentialism, you can also create a narrative that interrogates your own protection, your interventions in the environment, your government's approaches, and as such aim to avoid perverse intensives. And when kind of you shoot the boomerang, it comes way in a paradoxical, unexpected way, meaning that sometimes you have well-intended ideas, but simply the way you implement your policy, it turns out to be more damaging and harming than the benefit you want to derive. So this is a little bit was this strange loop ethics derived from a dialectical Hegelian synthesis thinking comes from, and what it allows us to offer. And as already Julie has seen, told us, and as we have seen in other talks, we have here sort of the dialectical growth represented in a form of evolution, in which ecology, management, ethics, philosophy, they all inform each other. We have a process of co-construction. In the future, we will have emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, cognition. I mean, this all shows us that ecology should not be seen as something, as an isolated domain, but rather as something where the whole circle, as represented here, can only be informed by being as broad as possible, work in a transdisciplinary fashion, work from an angle where you have a pluralism and try to bring in as much knowledge domains as you can. And with this, I'm concluding the talk, and some key takeaways is that ecosystems, as we conceive them, are intrinsically dialectical, that its limits and constraints that drive transformation. Hybrid regimes are key to managing change, and dialectics can provide not only theoretical, but also practical tools. I mean, as I said, in one sentence, dialectical ecosystems teach us that it's important to navigate unreducible tensions in ecosystem dynamics and never try to fully iron them out, as much of ecosystem science is trying to do. And as a very final disclaimer, we had an interesting email exchange with a colleague who was concerned about our framework, ecological framework, kind of the risk of introducing some of Hegel's historical political views, which were sometimes, which would be under contemporary circumstances no longer be tolerated. And I think our brief answer is we only use the scaffolding for ecological purposes here. You can never discard if to get misinterpreted and our framework misconceived, misunderstood. This is beyond us. We can't deal with that. But our a priori reasoning here is dialectics as a purely methodological tool that can form the ecological sciences, and which also has management and governance potential. without Hegel's historical views that, yeah, are no longer kind of suitable. And we really look forward, thank you for your attention, and we look forward to an interesting panel discussions where I hope we can inspire some contribution there. So thank you very much, and looking forward to taking questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Engler and Dr. Maybee. So your presentation exemplified the practicality of adopting dialectical thinking to conceiving hybrid ecological regimes, ecosystem management, and technological social application. Dr. Maybee started by giving a more proper explanation of the typical thesis, antithesis, synthesis explanation by describing that the three moments are more properly a fixity, and then a dialectic that the fixed thing is only defined in relation to its other, which leads to a speculative moment where this series of what is fixed is defined in reference to its other, which is also defined in reference to its other, and you have this kind of endless series which can be encapsulated as a being for self. She gave the example of you have red, and then things that are red, and that those things that are red are different among each other, but they're encapsulated in red. The same thing for states of water. So this gave us an idea of how dialectic can be mapped onto logic and nature. Then Dr. Engler gave a description of dialectics as an integrative explanatory power, how the idea that opposites negate each other, but also elements are preserved in that negation, actually manifests through disturbance, stability dynamics, wet-dry phases, productivity, decomposition, homogeneity, and heterogeneity, and the tension of opposites, how that manifests in ecological phenomena, in social responses to the ecological phenomena, like he was saying, the tension between the scientist and the system that it's studying, the scientist is studying, well, actually, the scientist is wondering, am I a part of this system? And it was just really, obviously, a high-level ecological presentation. So thank you very much. Any questions, please? Dr. Arnold, great.
Thank you for the talk. I found that really interesting. I just have a comment. I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but the dialectic that you talk about with ecosystems is, fascinating. I think it's interesting that there's this memory that is sort of doesn't disappear. We can certainly see that in social systems, and I have some thoughts about that we could talk about maybe later. But in Hegel, there seems this hierarchical structure, right? So you're always getting something better. I mean, at the end of your, at your synthesis, to use the language he doesn't use, but in your case, there could be a kind of negative, outcome, and negative insofar, or we just have to get rid of the hierarchical language altogether. You just get a different system at the end, but it's one that doesn't have as much biodiversity. It's somehow a degraded ecosystem in those terms. That we might end up with one that's not very suitable for humans at the end, and we had one suitable for humans at the beginning. That's just an observation about the one thing that pops out that seems a little bit different in the dialectic that you talk about here. Very fascinating. I'm not sure if you want to do
Yeah.
with that, or if you disagree or whatever.
No, thank you very much. This is an interesting observation. And of course, I mean, we are concerned by regime shifts in the way you mentioned, right? We have many negative consequences on the environment. So we do have a normative component, which in resilient science is of importance to humans. But then also perhaps we can see it as crisis opportunity, because this provides us with a whole new way of studying systems, and we can gain novel insight. So we do have a positive aspect, definitely on the epistemic side. Our knowledge of the system increases. We understand systems better. So it's perhaps just a matter of how we want to see things. Sure, there are different dimensions playing out, and those dimensions can be mutually informative. They can be diametrically opposing, but this is definitely where scale hierarchy, not only in a strictly hierarchical level, but also like in terms of parallel universes, so to speak, pans out in ecology.
Very
I have
interesting.
another comment if you don't mind. Uh, well, so I'm talking a little bit later about the application of some Hegelian ideas that's really are influenced by the biology of his time, but that I think he conceives of as thought determinations that apply to all these different systems. And so, like I said, he refers to the state as an organism and so on. And when I think about what you're doing in reference to state politics, I mean, if I could take the United States, we can see the end of enslavement. We get a Reconstruction period, um, and we end up with these I these memories, and these movements and these things don't disappear. Right after the end of enslavement, you do get African Americans elected to government fill positions in the United States. You also get the rise of the KKK. You get Ulysses S. Grant, who kind of cracks down on them and contains them for a little while, and then uh, they don't disappear. They come back, and then you get the whole Jim Crow era, where you have some memories, and not only memories, but then modes of behavior and so on that are trying to, I guess, capture what had existed earlier. You get these forms of discrimination that are perpetuated and so on. We get a civil rights movement. But at the time that happens, by the way, in 1960, in Mississippi, 6% of African Americans register to vote because there are lynchings going on in the South, and they know that, they could theoretically register to vote, but it's quite dangerous. So they don't. They don't want to subject themselves to that danger. So then we get the civil rights movement. We get the memory of the Reconstruction was still there too, and you have different movements in different parts of the country and so on that are going on. And then we get, now a rise of Christian white nationalism and so on, white supremacism again. So, I mean, I think it's interesting to think of these social systems, at least as a heuristic, it has heuristic value to think of them as kind of echo systems, where whatever comes into existence after something is sublated um, does retain the memory of those earlier things and the will and impulses. So I may have said too much, but I'm just, again, making an observation.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. It's always memory left and new memory created based on the old memory.
Yeah.
And this, yeah, as you say, one ecosystem, and we humans work as ecosystems in one way or the other, social systems, social ecosystems, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you for this enriching dialogue. Um, I have one question. Um, so, obviously, you very thoroughly thought out how dialectical logic manifests in ecosystems at that level of organization, in very practical ways, obviously, you have described. So, I'm wondering if you have any speculation on how similarly it can be applied to lower levels of organization at the organismic level, organ, tissue, or cell level, including so how these memories carry over from one state to the next state. And, like something that came to mind about that is during mitosis, when the cell splits into 2, then 4, then 8, and 16. And then at 16 cells, that's when it starts to specialize. But before that, it's kind of like an indeterminate stem cell. And then once they start to specialize after that 16 cell phase, if the plasticity in those more determinate phases of cellular development are a result of the memory of the superplasticity of the stem cells at the earlier stage of mitosis. That's the one example that came to my mind, which is also a speculation. I don't even know if that's correct. But if you've thought of anything in that line.
Yeah, I think this is definitely. I mean, we operate. If I can go back to this idea I expressed about potentialities floating in a sort of Aristotelian world of potentia, in an immanent world, then what we come to see is just an actual actualization along evolutionary, biological, and environmental constraints, right? So even at lower levels, this might sound too abstract, you should have operating the evolutionary constraints, which pulls the memory from the past into your current dynamics, but you have also like the more biological present day moment like interactions which can take place during mitosis or meiosis, and under the influence of environmental constraints, where let's say you have toxic exposure, mutations take place, your memory gets biased, and all of a sudden you create a new memory in the mutation, and cancer arises. In this process of cancer creation, you do have the memory from the past present, but it just gets distorted in a way where it creates a new cell dynamics, system dynamics, which manifests in the form of I might be wrong, I want to call a dialectical synthesis here, which is cancer, and as such keeps growing, and eventually, as everything is co-constructed, you do not only need to see the cancer or the cancerous cells as an independent entity, because if you do chemotherapy, for example, you can perhaps be successful, get rid of the whole cancerous cells, and the original memory from healthy cells from the past also comes back in, right? So you have a form of retrocausality where you can, from the future, back access, due to those evolutionary constraints which have been operating in time, your past memories, and as such, eradicate the cancer in our example. So, I mean, this is definitely something which I see operating here at the level of your interest, perhaps the organismic, the cellular, like the level of a tissue, right? Not even perhaps a human being or an ecosystem or a social ecological system. So all those constraints, I think, shall be conservative. We've been talking about agency and the telos. I mean, a system always strives towards self-preservation, self-actualization. Self-organization is an essential core topic in ecosystems, right? So we have this agency. There is agency in this self-expression. And is there a telos or not? I don't know. If a system wants to express itself, then for what does it express itself? To continue towards the future, to provide a new basis for a dialectical process. And as such, perhaps there is a telos, perhaps not. But I mean, this gets too much into the philosophical realm. Maybe Julie has some more concrete ideas here. But I mean, again, it seems everything so intricately linked in a co-constructive process that, yeah, even sometimes counterintuitive ideas from quantum mechanics or retrocausality all of a sudden start to make sense, so to speak. Not sure, Julie, you want to chime in?
Oh, sure.
If we have
So
the time.
I was thinking of, a bit of Nietzsche without the Hegel, sort of dialectics without the telos, um, without the idea that the development is going somewhere, towards some kind of absolute resolution. We see that more in, for example, Nietzsche's views, where there is some dialectical development, but it's not, we're not getting better and better every day. To use the pop psychology terminology. And I think that that's always been where my heart is, that I'm very sympathetic to Hegel's heuristics, without a lot of the political stuff. As Kwasi Wiredu once said, one can touch many of these 19th century philosophers, only while, I can't remember the expression he used, but something like, holding one's nose, given their views, Hegel's views, for example, about women and people of color, for instance. But nonetheless, his dialectics, I think, is a wonderful heuristic device. But also, I've always had trouble with his telos, the idea that this is developing somewhere that somebody planned out, and more the kind of ordered chaos of Nietzsche.
Thank you for those comments. I'm very interested in this middle out approach that Dennis Nobles talks about, where instead of bottom up causality, which is traditional reductionistic thinking, or exclusively top down, which is more traditional organicism, and where it doesn't look at the analytic view, this middle out where, based on the question at hand, we start at that level and can work our way to the other levels. So I think that is relevant to this question of, is there telos at various levels of organization? Because from the organismic level, it seems clear that there is a telos in development, right? In that the species concept is the telos of the development from the single cell forward. So further explication of how that goal state organizes that whole process of development and whatever insights come from that kind of evaluation, if and how it could help looking at the ecological level, and perhaps either clarifying or not whether there is a telos at that level, would be interesting, I think, for future work. Dr. Engler, I liked very much what you seem to imply, that the dialectic logic is almost a framework of development that can involve retrocausality, that then how it manifests at the different levels of organization is based on the constraints of that system. So if biological constraints or ecological constraints or social constraints, and then that would characterize how that dialectic logic would manifest at that level, is based on looking at the particular nature of those constraints. I think that was very rich. Thank you very, very much.